Dear friend, make yourself comfortable, get your popcorn, your little plate of ham, your drink, whatever you like, because today we're going to watch a spectacular video. I'm going to show you how to find those kinds of moves that when we see them in games, like the ones on this channel, we say, wow, what an amazing move. How can anyone possibly find a move like that? When in my own games, the kinds of moves that come to mind for me are just developing pieces, right? Castling, maybe breaking a little with the pawns, and that's it. Well, there are methods, okay, to find these kinds of moves, and today we're going to see it through an example. But don't worry, I'm going to show you in a way that all of us will be able to do it, not just for those players who are really, really good. In this game, which if I remember, because honestly I often forget, I'll leave it for you down below in the description. It's a game from quite a few years ago. I'd say about 80 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to focus on the player with the white pieces, who played the Spanish opening. By now, most of you probably already know which opening that is. Knight to f3, attacking a d5 pawn. Knight to c6, directly defending it. So we attack the defending knight directly. There's really no mystery to it. In this game, a variation was played that nowadays, you don't see it much anymore. Here, what's normal? Well, usually they're playing knight to f6, or even more commonly, they kick out the bishop, right? With the pawn, yes or no? I'm sure this is what people play against you in your games. But at this point, the player with the black pieces chose the move d6, a more passive move, a move that lets us... I can't even talk, sorry. A move that lets us immediately propose something, since they're not threatening anything at all, right? And of course, we can take advantage of that, just like they do in the game, with the move e4, gaining space in the center and immediately putting pressure first on this pawn, which is directly threatened because it's attacked by two pieces and only defended by one. Remember, the knight doesn't count because it's pinned, and we're also threatening a possible advance, targeting the knight on c6, which is indeed pinned. Therefore, here black already starts to suffer from the very beginning of the game. Move number 3 or number 4. It's true that they're not lost at all, but it is true that they're already forced to play passively, and that's good news for us. The advice I give you is that whenever you can, try to look for active moves. In other words, moves that pose some kind of threat, right? Like now, when we're threatening here and here. Black defends with bishop to d7. As you can see, the only problem that was looming over both attacks was the pin of the bishop on the knight. With this move, bishop to d7, black's problem seemed to disappear. But the difference between white and black is that white is launching attacks, while black, on the other hand, is just trying to defend against everything white is throwing at them. A very interesting idea that often comes up in these kinds of positions, where black is really cramped in here, is to sacrifice this light squared bishop. This isn't what happened in the actual game, but I'm showing it to you because it's a very interesting idea that you can carry out in your own games, where blacks should recapture with the bishop to avoid doubling pawns, and then not push this pawn, because after bishop to e7, black's counterattack with a possible f5 in the long run is very strong. Instead, well, as you already know, those of you who are students at the academy, you'll understand that pawn chains should be attacked from the base. That's why the break black should be looking for is this f5. So don't push this pawn, but for example, simply play knight to c3, a calm queen to e2, and white's position is relatively better than black's, since this pawn is being threatened, there's the threat of advancing and forcing the bishop to retreat, and with queen to e2, many more threats are created. For example, opening up this square here when the queens can't be traded, and so on. Well, it's a very interesting idea that I didn't want to overlook, because you can use it in your own games when you see that your opponent is playing very defensively. And remember, trade off this bishop, and then afterwards, just keep developing, capturing here with knight to c3. In the game, however, white went straight for knight to c3. Well, that's just another idea. We're getting closer to the key moment, so you can see how we can find spectacular moves, not just because they're beautiful, but because they actually work and help us win games, especially when we often don't know how to make progress. Black continues with knight to f6. It's true that they're putting some pressure on the d4 square, but for now it's well defended by the knight on c3. Therefore, white can keep developing, and what better way than to castle? All right, now black at this very moment starts to attack, right? And they capture the pawn on d4. Well, don't worry, when tension starts to build in the game, it's simply time to keep a cool head, right? And start analyzing your options. Yes or no? I guess I'm being a bit repetitive, but those of you who are in the academy with Flavia will have understood all these kinds of patterns, right? And honestly, I'm really glad about that. At this point, it's true that they've captured a pawn from us, but we can get it back, right? With knight takes knight, and when they capture, queen takes pawn. Yes or no? And then we'd also be defending the bishop from here, meaning there's no problem leaving this bishop here. However, we also have the other option of, instead of capturing the knight first, capturing the bishop with check first. We need to think about which option benefits us more. Well, what I'd be thinking here is, if the options are either to capture here or let them capture me, I prefer to capture because if they capture me, I'll have to recapture with a knight, and a knight here would end up a bit poorly placed. Look, I'll show you. For example, if we capture here, right? After these captures, when they take my bishop, they can always chase that knight away with the pawn. And yeah, this position isn't very pleasant either, because we're going to have to waste a move bringing the knight back, and we really could have avoided that just by exchanging bishops first. That's why now I'm going to show you the continuation that happened in the game. At this point, this is how things stood. I'm missing this knight that just captured, and I'm missing this pawn. All right. At this point, where they just played knight takes pawn, white simply captures this bishop first, and what's the difference? Now, when we capture the knight, you see, all of this is forced because we're just exchanging pieces. They can't directly attack anything anymore. Well, they could attack the queen. That's true, but in exchange for what? Well, they would have to play c5, and that would leave them with a really bad pawn structure. The d6 pawn will be backward, and since it's on an open file, remember this, a backward pawn on an open file is very easy to attack head on. So this would be a pretty serious positional mistake that could later be exploited with strong pressure on that point, right? And so black wouldn't gain anything. So we don't have the knight over there. Our pieces are very well placed, and the big difference from the previous position is that now we can keep attacking and maintain the initiative. Meanwhile, look closely. After this bishop to e7, you can see that black is boxed in back here. Again, the difference between white and black is that white is taking the initiative while black is just defending. You get it, right? Ring. So now comes the moment to say, well, nothing's really happening here. There are no pieces attacking each other. There are no threats. We need to keep playing. We need to think about strategies. Developing the bishop would be the main thing to do, right? It's probably the only minor piece we have left. We've already castled, so most of us would develop the bishop. However, there are moves that are a bit more penetrating. Since we've already castled, and our opponent hasn't, it's usually a really good idea to start applying pressure. And how do we keep applying pressure now that we have that space and development advantage? Although, let me clarify that for a moment. It doesn't really look like we have a development advantage, does it? I'm missing a knight here. I'm sure a lot of you were already paying super close attention to this. Many of you might say, there's no development advantage. The black pieces have developed 2 pieces, and we've only developed 1. The idea is that we've already castled, and this bishop will come out whenever we want it to. So we still have that development advantage that the white pieces get, since they start the game. At this point, white plays rook to d1, a move that puts on a lot of pressure. What's the threat? Well, the threat is this. After castling, play e5 and try to create problems for our opponent. We're threatening the knight, and a lot of you might say, well, just capture the pawn. No, because the queen isn't well enough defended by the knight, since we've brought the rook in, and then they'd lose material. That's why there's no other choice. You have to keep defending with knight to e8. All right, let's take a moment to evaluate this position. White keeps attacking, black keeps defending, and be careful. Sometimes just attacking isn't enough. If your opponent defends well, we might not be able to do anything. But it's really tough to defend the whole game and always have a good answer for every attack your opponent throws at you. That's practically impossible, so it's usually not a good idea to spend the whole game just defending. So, how do we keep up the pressure now? By developing the bishop to bishop f4. As Capablanca used to say, we should always look for the best move in every position. There are probably several good moves, but we need to see which one is best. Should we move a rook, move the bishop? Which is better, here or here? Well, definitely here, because we're putting direct pressure on this point. Here, since we're applying a lot of pressure indirectly with X-ray pressure along the file on the queen, the usual thing would be to move it away, right? Because that relieves the tension a bit. Black can capture whenever they want and all that. However, even though that would be the most normal thing in the world, Black finds a very clever way to get into the defense. And the way is as follows: a 5. Come on, CHESSTEACHER, you're going completely crazy. How is this supposed to be a way to defend this central point? Well, yes, the idea is that now Black wants to get a little more active. Well, that's good, but the thing is, maybe it's just a little bit too late. The idea is that they want to bring the rook in along the 6th rank. Rooks work really well along the 6th and 3rd ranks, respectively, because they can join the attack. At this moment, the rook on the 6th rank, specifically on a6, would be very well placed. First, because it's on white squares and we don't have the white squared bishop to attack it. Second, because this knight can't easily go after it, so we can conclude that this rook won't be easy to attack. Also, this pawn is protected by the a pawn. Plus, from here, this rook could, at the moment we capture, after some exchange, end up capturing on d6 and becoming very active. Or, who knows, if at some point these pawns are captured, the rook could even join the attack. So look at what a clever way, one that probably very few of us would have thought of, to defend this d6 square. However, the player with the white pieces didn't let himself get intimidated, right? By this plan from Black, and what he did was actually even a little better and all. The plan is the same, to bring the rook over via the 3rd rank, right? But for several reasons. First, you can double up the rooks. Second, you can let the rook move over to the e-file. Third, we already have the rook on the 3rd rank ready to join the attack, right? A rook on the 3rd rank is really interesting. Look, you know what? I'm going to make a note to do a full class on bringing the rooks over via the 3rd rank for the Academy, because I think it's a really fundamental lesson that could be super useful for you. You already know you can join the Academy for just €1, right? Get 7 days all-inclusive for just €1. Weekly classes, you know what's included. The link is in the description below in case you missed it. And for just €1 or $1 if you're watching me from somewhere outside Europe, it's definitely worth joining. Yeah, hey, just so you know, okay? If you don't like it, you can just leave. That's it. Just click cancel. It's one click. And if you want, I'll give you your euro back. It's absolutely no problem. My goal is for you to learn as well as possible. If you're not going to feel comfortable, you can leave whenever you want. The idea is that now, when Black tries to bring the rook over to the 6th rank, they think they've got everything defended, but that's not the case. This is where the white piece's brutal plan begins. First, move the rook, which was a bit trapped before, let's say in the corner of the board, over to the central files. As we can see, White's pieces are very well placed. However, having your pieces well placed is one thing, and actually being able to do something with them is quite another. Although usually those two go hand in hand. Let's see how the attack continues, because you're really going to like it. The player with the black pieces decides it's finally time to move the queen back and activate her a bit more. There was always that dilemma here, right? Which we just saw being completely pinned down. White springs into action. A knight to e5, threatening a bishop that simply retreats. And now, after pawn takes pawn, and knight takes pawn, there's really no other option, right? If they capture with this pawn, that pawn would end up extremely isolated, very, very weak. Pawn structure is important. If they capture with the rook, they'd lose it to the bishop, so there's no choice but to capture with the knight, since white is already starting to attack. Rook to g3, the rook swings over on the third rank. How interesting, right? And now what they're doing is looking directly at the black king. This is a key moment in the game. What's being threatened? Well, watch out. Checkmate in 1 is being threatened. Queen takes on g7 right now would be checkmate, so black has to act immediately. Like I said, threats are really important, because then we force our opponent to find some kind of defense. And sometimes the defense actually hurts them more than it helps. Even though it seems like we're threatening a kid's checkmate, right? Checkmate in 1 with the quill. Basically, what we're doing is forcing our opponent to weaken their position. To stop it, they're going to have to move one of these pawns. For example, maybe the best option is to push this f6 pawn forward. And this is where the real, well, let me say it right. The real attack by the white pieces begins. First, start thinking about how to attack. The main question we need to ask ourselves is, how do I attack? How do I add more fuel to the fire? How do I bring more pieces into the attack? At this point, I can bring in the bishop. Even though it looks like this bishop is under attack, since the pawn is completely pinned, we're once again threatening the key square, the square that also defends the f6 point, the square that's being threatened by the rook and could very likely end in checkmate. What we're doing is forcing our opponent, once again, to defend. In this case, with the rook. And now the key moment, and this is what I explained to you at the beginning, right? How do we find those really strong, impressive moves that most of us mere mortals just can't spot, chess teacher? Well, I have a little trick, okay? And I'm gonna tell you about it right now. In fact, you've probably seen games like this. I have too, you know? When I bring one of my own games, it's because it's a spectacular game. I'm not gonna show you the ones where I get crushed, right? But you've probably noticed that many times I found really interesting moves that seem pretty hard to spot. Well, in this case, this moment is one of those times, and I'll explain the little trick to you, and I won't get too carried away. I'm always running my mouth, not my hands. Hey, Chesterner, you're really on fire. So the idea is that I ask myself, what if this happened? Even if the idea sounds crazy. Let me explain. For example, what do I see here? That here, I could deliver checkmate. Oh no, I can't checkmate because they capture me with a knight. I'm sure this happens to you too. So a lot of you would say, well, that's it. I can't get rid of this knight. I can't checkmate. I'll look for another plan. But no, what would I think? What little trick can I give you? Well, if this knight is bothering me, and if this knight weren't here, how do I get rid of it? Even if I have to sacrifice, for example, the queen. Why? Because I know I'm going to checkmate. Check, they'll have to block, and then I'll give check and mate. So, here I think, how do I capture it? Well, first I think, hey, if I move this knight, can I sacrifice it with the queen? No, but of course, where do I move this knight? Because, for example, if I move it back here, threatening the queen, I'm blocking myself. If I move it forward, I'm also blocking myself. If I capture the pawn on f6, which might seem very interesting, they simply take me with the bishop, attack my queen, everything stays covered, and really, absolutely nothing has happened here. On top of that, the bishop is defending the checkmate square. So capturing on f6 isn't a good idea either. But then we might think, even if it sounds crazy, what about knight to b4? What happens then? Well, it attacks the rook and tries to eliminate the knight, even if it means sacrificing the queen. It's a real attack. If I take the knight, it's mate. So, checking all knight moves, despite appearances, knight to b4 is brilliant. Simply because we force our opponent to make a decision, either defend against mate, because right now the threat is clear, queen takes and rook on the 8th rank would be checkmate, or defend the rook. But there's no way to do both at the same time, you see? The rook can't come over to defend, so it's a brilliant move. Black chooses to take the knight, they really don't have anything better, and you'll see why. So then, how should we continue? Well, that's right, by capturing with our knight. Another brilliant move, but one that can come to us if we keep thinking, what if? What if? Remember this, because believe me, it can really help you a lot in your own games. Now, you might think, chess teacher, if they take the queen, great. I'll checkmate after rook takes g7. But wait, what's happening? Aren't they taking the queen? No. They're just not going to take it, and that's that. I gave up a knight, and now I've gotten a knight back. We're back to being even in material. And that's what happened in the Dane. The player with the black pieces defended, and at this point, our whole plan falls apart. A lot of you might be thinking, well, now what? Well, at least I can get this pawn back, and even though my attack seemed a lot more lethal, I'm going to play with an extra pawn where I have this 3. Against 2 on the queen side, which will most likely end up being 1 with good technique. But of course, it's not the same to try to checkmate as it is to play a game with just 1 extra pawn and apparently no compensation for my opponent and try to win in the long run, right? So we have to keep thinking to see if we still have any chances. And once again, we go back to thinking, what if, right? Well, it's the same here. For example, at this moment, if this queen disappeared, we wouldn't be able to checkmate anymore because they could block with the rook. Actually, yes, we could. We'd give a check, the rook would block, and again, rook takes g7 would be mate. So, well, now we have some ideas again, right? But of course, I'd like it, for example, if this rook were pinned, right? For example, if we could place the queen here or here, I'd like the rook to be pinned, because then the rook on the 8th rank would be checkmate right away, since they couldn't block with the rook because it would be pinned, right? So then we might think, what happens if I put the queen here? Well, nothing, because the rook would just take the queen and nothing else would happen. I've lost the queen for nothing. But what if I put it here? They can't take it with the queen, because remember what we just said, the queen can't move, or it would be checkmate again. Remember, it's not an immediate mate, but when the rook comes in and when it takes here, we take this rook, right? So this would actually be checkmate. Therefore, we realize that if we just move the queen one step back, even though at first glance it might seem like a move we'd never think of in our lives, it could actually come up, right? With this little trick. Why? Because we're making the threat we want and tempting our opponent to take the queen and lose the game immediately. Is there any way to escape the attack right now? What is the attack? Very easy. The attack is as simple as rook takes pawn, since now the rook can't recapture because it's pinned. So the idea would be either to push this pawn forward or to move the king away. The bad news for black is that if they push the pawn, we would simply end up checkmating in a few moves. How? Well, for example, by doubling up on this file, and it would be very rare for them to escape since we have this bishop guarding any possible escape route for the opponent. So I'm telling you, this would end in checkmate, and more specifically, at worst in 6 moves, because I checked before recording the video. Therefore, pushing the pawn doesn't work here. They have to try to move the king. If they try to escape toward the h-file, this would be very simple. Why? Because we would capture the queen first, forcing the rook to come over here, and then we would checkmate. It's that simple. So the king has to escape to f8, which is what happened in the game. But now we go back to thinking about that little trick. And if, for example, what could I quickly tell you? What would happen if, for instance, we captured with the pawn, with the bishop? Well, they would simply recapture with the rook and nothing at all would have happened here. We have no attack, we can't get in here, and we can't get in there either. Well, but you have to think about it, right? And if I capture with the rook, well, at first glance, nothing happens either, right? They capture me with the rook. Careful, they can't capture with the rook, because if they did, we could keep capturing the queen for free, since the rook wouldn't be able to recapture. Hey, so I'm going to keep calculating here to see what happens. Okay, they can't capture me with the rook, and the threat is to take this rook away, right? Because the king has no escape. But the king can't move either. So what do the black pieces do here? Well, they can't move. That's the trick. They can't move. And how do we finish this game? Well, here black resigned. In fact, this happened and black resigned. And I'll explain why. It might seem like the black pieces can be saved. For example, by blocking with the bishop. That would be queen takes rook, checkmate. It might seem like black could save themselves simply by capturing the rook and seeing what happens, right? And hoping for the bust. But no, because this was simply in the following way, just as I explained. Queen takes, and even though there's a bit of material compensation, there's no way to stop checkmate, since the threat is to bring the rook in on the back rank. And as you can see, even if they try, for example, to escape this way, queen takes rook would be checkmate. And even if they try to block it with the bishop, we would capture it first and then take this rook. Therefore, black can't escape. I hope you start taking advantage of these kinds of tricks. It's all a matter of practice. You should start thinking, what if? What would happen? As you look for combinations, I think you'll get some really good results. Like everything, it's a matter of practice. Just like, of course, you should practice at the academy. Of course, obviously. Every week we upload a class that's much more complete than this one. Both myself and FIDE Master Flavia Canciobello, who you all love, her way of explaining things is super fun, and she has an incredible level. You'll love her. And every week we upload classes that are more complete and longer than this one. And also, by joining the academy, you get full access to ChessMind. You already know that ChessMind is a paid service, right? Well, you get full access. But don't get confused, okay? ChessMind is just part of what you get. You get access to the academy with all its classes, plus full ChessMind access, where you know everything inside. So now you have a 7-day trial for just €1. If I were you, I'd give it a shot. You sign up for €1, and if you think, hey, chess teacher, I'm not interested, you just cancel. That's it. You've only spent €1 and can even ask for a refund. It's basically nothing. If you really like it and want to stay and keep training, well, then just keep going. There's no commitment. Want to stay for a month? It'll be 19, in euros I'm talking. It's €19 with everything included. That's the highest price in the academy, so you get everything included for a really good price, always. So I wholeheartedly recommend it. You'll find it in the description or by going to chessteacher.chessmind.ai, all right? And I'll see you inside. And I'll get in touch with you as always because I want to make sure you're super happy, especially all of you who really want to train seriously in the academy. See you soon and a big hug, friends. Goodbye.